Welcome, everyone. Welcome. My name is Luis Guevara. I'm the Senior Academic Coordinator with the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies in a unit of the College of Liberal Arts here at the University of Texas at Austin. On behalf of our chair, Dr. Arba Chavez, the faculty, staff, students associated with MALS, we want to welcome you to this La Llegada Student Research Symposium Day 1, featuring two of our portfolio students and one of our honors thesis students. They will be presenting their research work to you, the university community, family, friends, colleagues, loved ones, and some strangers. Basically, they have 15 minutes to present their work. Their work will be basically an outline. 15 minutes is not very long. They each have an initial 5 minutes for Q&A in the chat feature, please. They will not be able to take questions orally, but through the Q&A, so type in your questions. And then at the end of our third presenter, Jacob Blas, there will be another 20 minutes where they can all answer questions. We should be done before 4 o'clock Central Standard Time. The key, of course, is the 15 minutes that each student has to get through, present their work to you and the other colleagues, and then get through our Q&A. So at this point, let me introduce each of them to you. Their credentials, their background, the title of their respective presentations, and then we'll turn it over to our first presenter for today. I will say that the overall presentations today, this symposium, are being recorded as a Zoom webinar. They will be available on the MALS website about the end of this week and through MALS and Latino Studies social media platforms. If you're not able to watch live, but you're watching this recorded, thank you for joining us. Also want to thank, if I don't want to overlook this at all myself, I want to thank the staff with the Department of Mexican American, Latino Studies and Latino Studies units, Katie Buchanan for her leadership, Alex Palacios for his visual work with the publicity, flyers, and other forms of visual work, and then Ashley Nava Monteros for helping us and doing all the great technical work behind the scenes, particularly the webinar setup, and getting the outreach through social media and visual platforms. And thank you all for your support. So our first presenter today will be Anneleise Azua. She is a doctoral candidate in the Department of American Studies here at UT Austin. The title of her presentation, Growing Pains, Environment, Identity, and the Culture of Border Healing. Anneleise, would you please join us?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I will be presenting today a section, I guess, based on 2 chapters of my dissertation. So I titled it Growing Pains. I'll be sharing my screen now, and please let me know if you're not able to see anything. I think I'm on now. Okay. The title of my presentation is Growing Pains, Environment, Identity, and the Culture of Border Healing. Some of you from the department know me. I focused on a very similar topic for my master's thesis. But I wanted to start out by saying that this journey has been very long, and wanting to focus on oral and public history has kind of forced me to zigzag my way into all different aspects of this topic, which is curanderismo or curanderas, or traditional healing, and the culture of that in South Texas and in Mexico. Today, this presentation is focusing on South Texas in particular. And I titled it Growing Pains because part of the 20th century in South Texas just sees such a rapid surge of development, of population expansion, of agricultural development. And this is the time period that I'm looking at. And so Growing Pains for me exemplified the type of response, loss, land redistribution, rapid changes, labor redistribution that happened in the 20th century in South Texas, and how that affected these three areas. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'll start just with a visual of the map many of us know as the disputed territories of the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, trying to decide where this border would be, what would be expanded into Mexico only a few years later, and Texas being annexed as part of the United States. So I focus mostly on these disputed territories right here that have the stripe pattern, and set that up for a discussion of the type of development, quote unquote, that would be set up there when the railroads came and more rapidly the area was populated by very wealthy Anglo agricultural developers and settlers, but also by Mexican immigrants at the same time. This is a short outline of my dissertation thus far, and it's focused on, for those that are not familiar with the term curanderismo, a short description of that is that it is a centuries-old folk healing system with all type of global influences, but mainly my focus is on the Mexican and Mexican-American practice of it, which ranges with all kind of different kind of practices, I guess, would fall under this category, from herbal remedies to massage, prayer, spiritual cleansing, midwifery, and sometimes witchcraft and magic. In this case, I'm focusing more on traditional botanical medicine, herbal remedies, and sometimes the spiritual aspect of that. So I have 4 chapters that focus on the environmental changes and land use and its effect on medicine, the discussions and discourse on race and indigeneity, which a lot of these practices are based on, and how the settler colonial history in South Texas then impacts the discussion of race in this practice. And the 3rd and 4th chapters have to do more with the transnational aspect of these networks of care that have to do with medical tourism, the 3rd chapter, and the 4th on some markets and exhibits in Mexico City where the narrative on race and culture is much different than it is in Texas. So it's a little bit of a comparative study, and I'm focusing on the first 2 chapters here. Here for environmental shifts, I'll start by saying that a lot of environmental studies scholars have inspired this work for me, and to understand that environmental studies does not just mean pollution or things that do directly affect people's health, but also the distribution of land, the creation of borders and industry, and the distribution of domesticable plants and animals that ultimately play a leading role in abetting power, giving and granting land to people or taking it away from people. So in some of the oral histories that I conducted, many people described to me in the time period between the 30s and the 60s, losing their land to developers, changing their professions because of the job availability in agricultural work, or just not having the same access to large plots of land and cattle as they did in the previous period. This is a major factor in local livelihood. And so this chapter focuses on the type of ecological imperialism of this area's settlement of the area, and how for some it became the Magic Valley, a very prosperous area for agriculture where you can come buy cheap land, but how that really displaced not only the Tejanos that were already there, but the indigenous people who contributed most to the practices of this type of healing network, and who the Mestizo and Tejanos were already adopting indigenous networks, but not really acknowledging that. So in the sense of looking at the environment, I have found a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists that are doing work on prehistoric Texan cultures and how that might have informed this time period. Here you have a picture of the railroad from 1907 that in the Centennial magazine describes this as bringing the first home seekers to the Rio Grande, which we know is not true, but how transportation affected the environment, as well as bringing settlers physically there. And then mesquite, which is found in many of the remedies that are indigenous to the region and that other people have adopted as they've settled. The second chapter is on changes in identity that I picked up on in not only oral histories, but in the archives. So there is, at first I had a hesitance on describing this. Is this Mexican? Is this Mexican American? Is this indigenous? It's kind of all of them. But in the archive, at least I have found this as being described as Mexican and being described as something that poor people do. They were described as cosas del indio, things of the Indian. And so there's very much a connection of this medicine practice to indigeneity and to poverty. And that being associated with being an Indian, but later being associated as something of the past that you do when you're poor, and that Americanization efforts allow you to kind of shed that poverty. A lot of words, very problematic words I found have been related to primitivism, savagery, and that the modern Mexican American, the modern Mexican tries to distance him or herself from these practices is something that came up a lot in the interviews on oral histories. But here's a photo of a flea market in South Texas that brings fresh herbs. So there are people that sell fresh herbs and people that sell dried herbs as compuestos for particular ailments. And vendors are able to purchase these, which some are brought from Mexico and some from local South Texas places. Then I think one of my favorite parts of this research, it's been the most exciting, but also hardest to process, has been material and oral history. I made a visit to the site of Don Pedrito Jaramillo. He's one of South Texas' most famous healers, but he is also a male. And what I've found in my interviews is that many women take pride in this being a domestic oral culture of home remedies, of domestic work where they all have their own gardens and they teach each other these things from generation to generation. So it's very interesting that the people I have found evidence of are primarily men, which doesn't really discuss the kind of daily practice of this healing that women are doing and passing on to each other. So I mainly focus on 6 life histories, but I've done interviews with about 15 practitioners or healers in the region. I've also been lucky enough to work with a museum where I was able to collect objects. And so part of my analysis focuses on the material culture and that being evidence of this past, whether you want to call it ethnic Mexican, Mexican American, or indigenous, but seeing how those all are markers of this local practice and identity, as well as different site visits. I see my work expanding on environmental humanities, on anthropological, medical anthropology and critical race studies, as well as oral and the public history of medicine. I think that in the future, I am wrapping up my last chapter and conclusion now. I am hoping to turn this into a monograph, but I'm also in the process of curating something with the Latino Center at the Smithsonian Museum on these practices. So I think there's a lot to say here, and it's taken me a really long time to whittle down what I want my contributions to be. But ultimately, I think it's very exciting given that this past year we've seen, unfortunately, huge gaps in healthcare coverage and how that affects Latinxs, especially on the border in relation to not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but coverage for healthcare, how they are affected by the economy and their dependence on certain labor markets. So I think this is fruitful work for understanding a culture where people are self-sufficient and try to answer these gaps through their own networks of community care or generational knowledge. So I will open it up for any questions, try to speed through there, but that is the gist of it, and I hope to chat with any of you all about it. Thank you. Should I keep the screen up or do I take it down?
I think you go ahead and take it down.
Okay.
Once again, if you have any questions for Anneleise, please type them into the chat. She has about 5 minutes of time that she can use to entertain questions before we go on to our next presenter. We will have question and answer at the very end. If you want to save questions, I can appreciate that as well. But while she just finished speaking, and if you have any questions you would like to ask her of this project and her presentation, once again, in the chat feature, if you don't mind, just dropping them in real quickly right now.
Okay, I have one question from Dr. Chavez that is, what's the most surprising thing you learned in doing this research? I think surprising and sad at the same time is maybe the amount of stigma and shame that many people felt in practicing this. How many people were unwilling to talk to me, or as I said before, used very problematic and hurtful and racialized terms to describe these practices, which I just thought were a really beautiful and interesting part of where I grew up. So kind of unpacking that stigma with poverty, with primitivism, and all kinds of words like that were pretty surprising when they're coming from Mexicans and Mexican Americans themselves that actively do this. So a bit of a paradox there, but. Sure, I have another question about Don Pedrito. I think that is a big archive of work that is still really fruitful. When I was visiting the site, there was people that had taken a bus down from California in like sweltering heat. They had taken a bus down from California, and they do this kind of pilgrimage every single year. There is all kind of candles, notes, personal requests that people make to at his gravesite every year, which is outside of Alfurrias. So I think that the books that have been written about him, and there's new work also. Someone named Jennifer Seaman is just released a book about him and Teresita, I think. So definitely one of the most enduring icons of the period, something I find most in the archive. But as I said, something that I tried not to touch on because I was approaching the more, I think, quotidian practice of this done by women in domestic care work. But he's a huge icon in this area and a really exciting character. The name of the book, I should know the name of the book. It's by Jennifer. I will write the name here. That's how it's spelled, and I think it's called Borderlands Curanderos or something along those lines. But she does focus entirely on Pedrito Jaramillo and Doña Teresita, I think, who's more California and Mexico based. But I used her dissertation a lot as inspiration for methods and things like that. It's really exciting work.
We have time for one final question in this segment for Anneleise. And like I said, at the end, we'll have time for all three of our panelists to have questions. So one final question, if it's directed for Anneleise at this time.
Okay, I have one. How did I reach out to domestic healers for interviews? Sure. So I will answer this really quickly, but I have been working on this as well for my master's thesis. So keeping those connections and following up on them and doing a kind of snowball sampling was really useful for me. But then actually through I did a fellowship 2 years ago at a museum where I was able to travel and actually got funding to do that. So that was crucial to getting money for traveling and meeting people, making connections in New Mexico and Texas and in Mexico City, who then introduced me to other people. So very much snowball sampling, very much having the ability and funds to follow through with those before COVID hit, of course. And there's definitely resistance, especially in some of the markets that I went to where it wasn't somebody that I knew personally or that was referred to me, but very much random stall owners. I could see that if I'm not a paying client, why should they talk to me? They have a lot of other things to do. But the fact that they're not sure of my intentions or what I'm going to be doing with their work, some people are called quacks or are otherwise facing sometimes legal issues and legal battles based on what kind of healing they do. So of course the suspicion is warranted, I think. But the people that were open to sharing with me, I think we will be friends for a long time. We've stayed in connection and I ask them questions all the time. So that's not the case with everyone. I think that's all for the questions, but of course we can circle back at the end of the presentations. Thank you so much.
Anneleise, thank you as well for your presentation. Audience, thank you for the questions directed toward her. Now we're going to transition to our second presenter today. This is Alejandra Garza. She is completing her doctoral degree in the Department of History. The title of her talk, and she's also a graduate portfolio student in Mexican American and Latino Studies, as is Anneleise, I should say. The title of her talk today is Recordando a los vaqueros, Life and Memory in South Texas. And once again, at the end, if you have 5 minutes worth of questions for Alejandra, please in the chat. Alejandra?
Hey, hello, everyone. So I have just prerequisite. I have a cat who loves to hear me talk. So if she jumps up, my apologies. But let me go ahead and share my screen. So first of all, I'd really like to say thank you to Luis and to everyone in the Mexican American Latina Studies Department for making me feel at home, even though I'm far from home in Austin. But it really has been a roller coaster of the last 5 or 6 years completing my dissertation research. But I am forever in gratitude to the colleagues and professors in the Mexican American and Latina Studies Department. So today, I'd like to take you through this journey of my research and give an outline of what my dissertation is going to look like, or is wrapping up to look like. And so I'd like to begin first with kind of this overview. This photo is one of the more recent photos that I've come across. I try and do a lot of my research through photographs because I am looking at vaqueros and men and women whose voices are not necessarily in a traditional archive, not recorded. And so photographs are one way of being able to look into the past. And so this is a photograph from around 1962 of vaqueros in Jim Hogg County. And I'll put up a map in a bit. But one of the vaqueros, this gentleman right here, hopefully you can see my mouse, but he is the second from the left. His name is Horacio Evers, and he's a central figure throughout my dissertation. I try and mention him in every chapter. Jim Hogg County is also a really central location for my dissertation. The reason why is because Evers is one of the vaqueros that I've been able to trace and gather the most information about to kind of outline this life of a vaquero. And so in a nutshell, my dissertation traces the evolution and celebration of Mexican and Mexican American cowboys, also known as vaqueros, in South Texas throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. And so to give kind of a visual of what I'm tracing. So this is Evers in the 1950s. And this is Evers up here in the center of top middle in around the year 2010. And so when I was presented with these two images, I was always wondering what happened in the middle. How does Evers go from being a vaquero, working on a ranch and a laborer, to this highly staged photograph that when I showed it at one of my earlier talks, an audience member pointed out that this gentleman here in the front is not even sitting on this like barrel. And I do know that all these men were photographed separately and photoshopped in together. And I'll talk more about the photograph later on when I get to that part of my dissertation. But this was a promotional photograph. So this journey to connect the dots happened with these two images. And so what you see here in my 4 bubbles are really the 4 chapters of my dissertation. And it's taken a while for me to figure out where the chapters fit, like in what order. You probably will change order, but for today, this is the order that I see them in. But one thing has remained true is that I see these chapters as in tandem with each other. So the ranching and the vaqueros chapter I see as a couple, memory and celebration as well. And so what I am pretty sure of is that ranching is going to be my opening chapter because it gives this overview of the area that I'm talking about. And so the main goal of this chapter is to examine the ranching industry in South Texas beyond 1900. And so Mexican American scholars, especially if you're in grad school, you know that most of our research and secondary sources starts with David Montejano's Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas. And so he is one historian who puts the end of these big cattle drives at 1900. And so while I was looking at Evers and his life and Jim Howe County, and these are events that are happening well into the 1900s. So I was able to step back and think, well, where historians stop, I can continue on with my research. So even though these big cattle drives up through Texas from South Texas ended in 1900, I argue that there's still this culture that's left behind, and especially you see in these small towns. And so that brings me to location. So sometimes I forget that most people don't know or can't grasp like how huge Texas really is. And so this star here is, if you're in Austin today, this is approximately where Austin is in Travis County. And I like to use a county map of Texas because it's easier to kind of pinpoint counties, especially because of the change that happens throughout the 19 teens, probably starting like 1910 to 1915. There's a huge shift in South Texas where counties get split up and created. And that's what happens in this red bubble down here. And so Jim Howe County, which lies in the center of my bubble, is really the center stage of my research. And like I said, it's because most of the sources that I'm able to find come from this area. But Jim Howe County was created from parts of Star to the south, Duval to the north, and Zapata to the west. And so that's why I include them in there, because sometimes the county records lie in those other counties. Brooks County, where Falfurrias is also a major player in this area for South Texas ranching. The reason why I usually why I wanted to stick to this area was because there's this gap in the historiography of Texas, and especially of ranching. And whereas Bexar County up here is San Antonio, these counties are, I think, too south of San Antonio to be a part of that history, but they're also not the Rio Grande Valley. which you'll see that I have a dot in Cameron County because some of my research does include Brownsville. This is kind of just orienting the location of my research. And so once I was done with this broad overview of ranching, I wanted to get deeper. And so that meant looking at vaqueros, so working class men and women who were the vaqueros of the Texas-Mexico borderland. And so that included men like Horacio. And so his story is one that's pretty typical of vaqueros in this area. He grew up in the county seat of Jim Hogg County in Hebronville. Jim Hogg County does have two other small towns that don't have more than like two to five residents. And Hebronville itself is only 5,000 residents. Work on a ranch and did that up until he was almost 80 years old. So this is someone who dedicated their life to ranching, but on the flip side, never owned a ranch, never owned the horses that you see here. These are at two different ranches in the 1950s. And his story was one that I heard over and over again while I was through like non-traditional archives. I've reached out to various people and gotten interviews that they've done back in the 1980s. So even though he was not the owner of this ranch, he was probably, I would say, one step below, which there was this hierarchy that existed in the ranch between all the workers. And the vaquero was at the top, seen as the jack of all trades, and certainly above the research. I really kind of stood on the shoulders of Hector Galan, who is an Austin-based documentarian, and his 1988 documentary, Vaquero, the Forgotten Cowboy, mentions most of the men that I've been researching and is set in Jim Hogg County. So it was definitely a great springboard to this research. And it also got me thinking about the next part, which is memory. And so there were looking at all these communities from going in the timeline of here are the vaqueros, and all through the 1900s, they're being told that their way of life is fading. But well into the 21st century, we're still talking about them. And we're still celebrating them, which we'll see in my next chapter. But these communities continue to curate an identity that I argue link them to a larger history of Texas. And so what you see is these anniversary issues of, this is Jim Hogg County's Enterprise newspaper. And even though this was in 1939, they're still calling ranching a major industry for them. You see local organizations start popping up in the 21st century. The Vaquero Association and Vaqueros of South Texas, which were founded 10 years apart from each other. And then on the larger scale, in 2012, you see the Tejano Monument at the Texas Capitol that features a vaquero. So these are just examples of where I've seen these links to this like forgotten way of life that isn't really forgotten. It's just evolving. And so part of that evolution are these festivals. This is a festival that I wish I could find more on, but it's from Duval County. It is their Fiesta del Rancho, and it takes place in the small town called Concepcion. It has maybe 60 people, but it brings thousands of people to the small town every fall. And this is from their 10th annual in 1987. So this was a festival that started in the late 70s. But again, you see the vaquero kind of at the forefront of this small town. And so for my last chapter, it evolved into this comparative chapter between Charro Days Fiesta, which is in Brownsville, and the Vaquero Festival in Hebronville, which is in Jim-Haw County. And so throughout my research, I've had to grapple with the definition of a vaquero, and this chapter helped me really pinpoint the differences and, for my research, the similarities between charros and vaqueros. A Brownsville, which is a big city, versus Hebronville, which is a small town. In the end, also bringing in some gender analysis into it with masculine versus feminine. And so for Charro Days, it's a festival that was founded in the 1930s by Ken Faxon. You see him here pictured with his wife, Bernadette. And they were not from Texas. He came down and was really wanting to start this tourism industry in Brownsville to get more people there. And so what he did was adopted this image of the charro and the señorita that you see on this postcard on the right image to really build that up. And then you have the Jim-Haw County Vaquero Festival and Pageant. So this is where the gender kind of comes in. For Hebronville, it wasn't about tourism so much as preserving this culture that since Galan's documentary in the 1980s and even before that, they were trying to hold on to. And so here you see this generational kind of transition where the vaqueros are still here, but they're represented by the young ladies of the community. Then you see their activities that vaqueros would usually do, such as roping, being represented by younger kids that are a mix of boys and girls. So here, just zooming in a bit. And so throughout all this research, I went a little fast in this, but it really is a culmination of research that started when I was an undergrad and trying to get to fill in the gaps of what happens in the middle of these. And so this promotional shot is one that is still used today for the Vaquero Festival. And it's instantly recognizable for anyone from the area. So I think that with my research, I'm trying to understand at what point does this evolution happen, and what does it mean for communities that want to preserve this image. And my timer just went off. So thank you, and I'm open for any questions.
Once again, any questions for Alejandra, please in the chat, and she can read her questions and answer them for the audience for about 5 minutes, and we'll have general questions at the end, of course. Alejandra, if you want to go ahead and stop screen sharing, that would be fine.
I'm sorry, I'm trying.
Okay, no worries.
Sometimes technology just doesn't want to work.
If you can't, I'll go ahead and stop sharing on my end since I'm a host. There you go. I do have, I don't know if you see it in the Q&A. I have a question. I guess I could read out loud real quickly for you, Alejandra.
Yes, please.
Okay. Can you say a little more about what you learned about the role of gender in constituting vaquero identity?
Yeah, so one of the chapter on vaqueros, I chose to put men and women, but unfortunately, the majority of archives and sources that I have been able to obtain are mostly about men. Women are mostly are present on the ranch, and when they are mostly housekeepers. But I chose to incorporate more of the gender in the last chapter on celebrations because of the presence of the pageant. And so there are images of these young girls up on stage in the pageant, and the vaqueros are front row. And part of the pageant is having the girls that are like age 7 to 17 recite a speech about what vaqueros mean to them. And so there's not, or the pageant is, I believe they don't have it anymore, but when they did, there was no mention of like having of like a young man perhaps represent them. It was always this, like, we need young girls. We need them to be our representation. And so it got me going into like, what does masculinity mean? And is it feminizing the vaquero, or is it like masculinizing these little girls? And so it's just a different way of like viewing what it's evolved into.
We have a question in the chat for you. I can read it really quickly if you want me to.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? You
Oh,
froze.
okay. There's a question in the chat. I can read it out loud real quickly, or you can read it if you would like, but there's one question from the audience for you in the chat.
Yes, please. They're not coming through.
Okay. Do you see charriera as related to the vaquero culture?
So what I've come to define vaqueros as, I've stepped away from the definition of vaqueros as an interior Mexico, like tied to indigenous cultures that I've seen most recently in Laura Barraclough's book entitled Charros. And instead, I choose to define it in the 20th century context that I'm looking at it, which is Mexican and Mexican American cowboys in South Texas. And for them, it's not so much of performance. It was more tied to labor throughout the 20th century. And so there were some questions of like the ranch rodeos that happen along with the festivals. But what I've seen in my research is that's a different type of environment that older vaqueros will say that's not a vaquero. Like we don't perform.
Do we have any other questions for Alejandra right now for the chat? If not, once again, we will have 20 minutes for the end, so we can have more questions at that point. I don't see any more questions in chat. So Alejandra, thank you. We're going to go and turn it over to Jacob next, and then we'll come back with any other questions we might have for you from the audience. So at this time, I'm going to introduce to you all Jacob Blas, who is completing his undergraduate BA in Mexican American Latino Studies This is his honors thesis. As part of the program, he's completing requirements. The title of his presentation is Anti-Mexican Violence, Race, and the Myth of Color Blindness. Jacob.
Hello, everybody. My screen is shared, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. So hello, thank you again for being here. I just wanted to start off by acknowledging my thesis advisor, Dr. Antonio Vasquez, for all of his diligent work throughout the process of this project. My commitment to this type of research and analysis would not have been possible without his guidance. I would also like to thank Dr. Karma Chavez, my second reader, for her patience and unending support of my work and helping me become a better scholar throughout the last year. So my work centers on race and colorblindness in the United States, and it examines how these forms of control have been utilized to uphold white supremacy and its reach throughout law, politics, and institutions, while also looking at how these mechanisms of dominance enact anti-Mexican violence through historical events and rhetorical analysis. These attitudes continue to intensify under liberal, neoliberal, and right-wing US politics that erase histories of violence and necessitate an ongoing response, criticism, and resistance in order to challenge white supremacy and colonial control of the bodies of people of color in US society, academia, and the political apparatus. So first of all, here is a photo of my grandfather here in the center that I'm pointing to, the little angry looking boy here. His brother is behind him. My great grandmother is right here. And this is her sister. And they're in Monterrey, Mexico in the early 1940s. And the reason why I have this picture here is because my project is inspired by the stories my grandfather retold about the Jim Crow days in the city of Wesco in the Rio Grande Valley, where I grew up when he was about this age in the photo and into high school. And he talked a lot about the trauma of being forced to wait outside white establishments in order to be served, because at that time, no Spanish, Mexicans, or dogs were allowed in establishments, among other forms of policing and surveillance with respect to movement in and around the city limits, schools, and churches. And this was a reoccurring motif throughout many of my grandfather's childhood stories. My interest in this work has evolved out of trying to understand how these histories took place and why they continue to manifest in different but nevertheless violent ways today for our community. And so here I have my 4 chapters, and so it's broken down by chapter 1, which is white domination in the United States, that begins with the formation of race, the ambiguity of race for Mexican ranchero elite in Texas, California, and the US Southwest, and how Mexican Americans navigated whiteness in the aftermath of the US-Mexico War. I also discuss how groups like the League of United Latin American Citizens used claims to whiteness to shape laws and policies, how Mexican Americans fought back in the 1960s and 70s, and the processes through which Mexicans are identified, ignored, and are recognized by the state. Chapter 2, Mexican Labor in the US American Imagination, analyzes Mexican labor in relation to capitalism, nativism, and policing. The history of Mexican belonging in the United States has always depended on labor, exploitation, and control. And I consider how Mexican labor in the US American imagination is maintained through the Mexican body being utilized as a source of labor for capitalist profit, including the ways in which eugenicists were appeased by agricultural business because they argued that docile nature of Mexican labor would keep them from challenging white society, and how the position of law enforcement allowed working class whites to differentiate themselves from poor Mexicans through status and power. Next, chapter 3, Race, Gender, and Border Violence in the Trump Era, includes examinations of the Remain in Mexico policy, separation of families, and impunity for US Border Patrol officers who enact violence and killings on non-US citizens at the border, with a focus on racialization and gender. I draw comparisons to historical processes of racialization and gendering of Mexicans in the US, such as the delousing of Mexican border crossers in 1917 at the El Paso Juarez, Mexico border, and contemporary examples such as the idea that fertile Latinas come to the US to give birth to anchor babies, and how Latino men are referred to as criminals or bad hombres, as was documented throughout the Trump administration. And lastly, chapter 4, Colorblind White Individualism, puts history, the present, and where we must move from here into perspective by critiquing colorblind narratives that lead to increased white dominance. I contend that in order to dismantle systems and institutions of white supremacy, we must hold white American individualism accountable and call for increased responsibility among our white counterparts to do the work necessary to produce real change for Black, Indigenous, Latina, and other communities of color. And because of our time constraints, I will focus on this chapter for the remainder of this presentation. So first, I think it's important to understand ethnic Mexicans and Mexican Americans in relation to what we know as race. Very quickly, this is a photo here of my great grandmother, who you saw in the other photo, Josefa's alien head tax receipt from 1930, as she crossed into Westlake, Texas. Here we see under race is written Mexican. And while it's important to note that even at this moment in history, Mexicans were legally white, they were considered socially and treated as de facto or by practice non-white. Further, the US Census for that year would categorize Mexican as a race. And here we already start to see the complexities of race where the law, society, and the state cannot agree on one category or definition. So to clear our understanding up though, I turn to definitions of racial formation and racialization, terms that might help us better understand Mexican Americans in relation to whiteness. So according to Omi and Winant, racial formation refers to the socio-historical process by which racial identities are created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed. By this definition then, race has the ability to change and shift over time. Racialization refers to the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified relationship, social practice, or group. In other words, racialization can come to categorize a person or a group of people as something other than white at specific time periods or in specific places. And so these definitions are important because as we look at Mexican Americans in relation to whiteness, the process of racial formation and racialization is applied in ambiguous terms. This is seen through numerous court cases throughout the 1930s and 40s and into the civil rights movement of the 1960s, where Mexican was thrown around in the courtroom as a race, a nationality, a protected person, a vulnerable person, a second-class citizen, etc. There have been scholarly debates about whether or not Mexican Americans or Latinas are a race, ranging from ruling the identity is simply an ethnicity to Ian Haney Lopez's argument that these identities are both a race and an ethnicity, and that we should look at how these identities have been racialized. Without a doubt, there is nuance in understanding the complexities of race. Some Mexican Americans pass as white or perform whiteness in certain spaces. However, it would be a mistake to ignore the histories of anti-Mexican violence, the court cases, the ongoing processes of systemic harm that impact Mexican American communities. Undoubtedly, claiming whiteness or assimilation is a response to the degree of anti-Mexican sentiment and violence experienced by Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the US American imaginary, including psychological, socioeconomic, and political traumas that have a lasting effect on how we see ourselves belonging in the nation state. And so before I get into the colorblind aspect of this, I would like to note Eduardo Bonilla Silva's explanation of colorblindness through one of his 4 frames, and that is cultural racism. And so cultural racism is the frame that engages in arguments based on culture to explain the plight of minorities in society. Cultural racism ignores historical and systemic implications of white supremacy, and it shifts the blame from inherent biological inferiority to a cultural one. And this is something that we saw within the court cases, especially in the 30s, 40s, 50s, where in the courtroom, it was argued that Mexicans were discriminated against because of language and their inferior culture, rather than as being a race, a specific race. And so this is evident through statements, also evident through statements today, like Mexicans do not care about their education, or Mexicans are lazy. And if you're interested in more of this discussion, I'd be happy to talk about the other 3 frames later during questions. So despite popular discourse claiming that the issues of race are far behind us, in other words, the idea that most people are colorblind, white nationalism and dominance are deeply ingrained in the United States national imagination and nation-building apparatus. Thus, looking at racialized attacks like the 2019 El Paso Walmart shooting as lone wolf or isolated incidents understates the systemic and institutionalized mechanisms of racial inequality still present today. While mainstream political responses to racially motivated attacks seem to denounce white nationalist visions, the state has yet to act on remedying such violence. Even in a time of great racial unrest and calls for racial justice, an end to police brutality, and the abolition of police and prisons, the state has not yet offered tangible solutions outside of reform, most of which actually give more funding to these violent institutions. As Bonilla Silva argues, that whites have developed powerful explanations which have ultimately become justifications for contemporary racial inequality that exculpate them from any responsibility for the status of people of color, which he labels colorblind racism. Colorblindness at face value then operates under the guise of a system that purports to promote anti-discrimination and racial equality. Yet, as we pull back the veil, what is revealed are the true intentions of colorblindness that show how its negation of the existence of racism contributes to increased racialized attitudes, because as movements for marginalized groups, such as Black Lives Matter, demand rights and changes, the dominant white group responds with the need for law and order. As Bonilla Silva says, colorblind racism serves today as the ideological armor for a covert and institutionalized system in the post-civil rights era. And the beauty of this new ideology is that it aids in the maintenance of white privilege without fanfare, without naming those who it subjects and those it rewards. Colorblind advocates who claim to be anti-racist root their support for the ideology in the fear that the opposite will lead to increased white nativism. What these advocates suggest is that we should be more afraid of the reaction that white Americans have when we point out their privilege, power, and the pain they have caused people of color and marginalized peoples. That instead we should focus on curing the individual white person rather than the population or race as a whole. Adia Harvey Wingfield offers a strong rebuke to this notion, contending that whites by and large enjoy the luxury of promoting the importance of the individual because they benefit from living in a racially stratified society where whiteness is normalized. Racial minorities, by contrast, become aware from a young age that people will often judge them as members of their group and treat them in accordance with the usually negative stereotypes attached to that group. Whites have history, the law, and institutions on their side. They have been able to manipulate, fabricate, and stratify how people of color live, work, and operate in the United States. Through these processes, whites who do not see race, are scared to talk about race, or simply state that they are not racist, endorse colorblindness to ignore the ongoing processes that maintain racial stratification in schools, neighborhoods, healthcare, and other social institutions. In other words, it is easier for whites to look past their history of violence and terror on communities of color and simply say that it is time for us to move on. The alternative that colorblind advocates and others like them are seeking is a process that is careful to tiptoe around white fragility. As we critique systems of white domination and supremacy, we must also be attentive to the ways in which whites continue to construct their worldview and comfortability at the expense of non-whites. So my goal for this project is to analyze how systems of white domination and racialized violence continue to have effects on Mexican-American communities today. At the same time, it is important to consider how we can use our positions to make change. Many of us ethnic studies scholars and community members are asking ourselves, what can we do? How can we stop our community from experiencing violence? And the truth is, the answer is not simple. We're living in a moment of dangerous attacks on Black, Indigenous, Latina, and Asian communities. However, given the historical legacies and resilience of Mexican Americans and other marginalized communities in the United States, we are called to march on, critique, and resist the systems of power that continue to suppress our communities. Through our scholarship, we can change the current naturalized state of whiteness, especially in academia, and be critical of its root in colonialism, imperialism, and domination. People often ask, especially as I've been doing this research, what are the next steps? Can we rely on the state to save us? How do we invest in alternative futures that are radically different from our current state? I argue that the possibilities are endless. Not only do we have to be willing to imagine, but we must also be wary of any state or political promises. If this project has demonstrated anything, it is that we live in a system that was created to function and serve only one group of people, and we know this to be true. However, our resistance over the centuries proves that we are capable of overcoming and prevailing. Envisioning alternative futures to white domination and supremacy that do not include institutions like the state is difficult, but we must be invested in the processes of education and community action that have guided movements in the past and present. Conversations like this one will lead to critical examinations of the way we live within the nation state and how we can find opportunities to support and care for our communities, especially those of us who have access to resources, privilege, and education. Our alternative futures must also reckon with the violent histories that have destroyed and subjected queer and trans people, disabled people, and women of color. Most importantly, we must listen to community activists, scholars, and those directly impacted. I admit that this work will inevitably produce uncomfortable discussions on race, the US as a nation state, and particular painful histories for communities of color and whites alike. I hope that this project is a point of learning and unlearning for every reader and listener. And I challenge everybody to look at how they access power and privilege, especially scholars who have the power to present this type of research. For the white listener, I must ask you not to take what you learn here personally, rather to take it as an opportunity to use your position to critique systems of domination that you benefit from and reject processes of privilege that have led to other communities' destruction. For the Black, Indigenous, Latina, person of color listening, I continue to stand in solidarity with you. Remember why you are engaged in this work. Reflect on your ancestors' resistance and the opportunity you have to participate in this fight today. And with that, I'll take questions.
Once again, any questions for Jacob, please in the chat, and he can read those questions and answer them for us. He's got about 5 minutes, and then we'll open them up to all our participants today. Thank you. In the chat. Jacob, I have a question that's been put in the Q&A section. I can read it for you if you would like.
I have it here.
Okay.
Yes, can you talk more about Afro-Mexican people and how they feature in your work, or put differently, what is the role of Blackness in your construction of Mexican racial identity? And that's something that even after I concluded the project, I realized that I needed to do more work on that. And I guess like just do more readings on like anti-Blackness. I think both as like Afro-Mexican identities, but also like anti-Blackness within like the Mexican American community and like these movements against or resisting the state. And so I do also know in the beginning of my thesis that Afro-Mexicans and like Afro-Latinx people are often overlooked in a lot of the scholarship. And so this is definitely an avenue that I would like to continue my work in further. Which chapter was the most challenging to write and research? I think chapter 1 was probably the hardest, just because it involved a lot of like court cases and just really like dense material that sometimes like, I guess, difficult to read and understand. It also involved a lot of like very painful and traumatic accounts of like killings and lynchings and mob violence. And that was like the hardest thing for me to kind of like, I guess, work through. And I think that was a chapter that probably took the longest, because I kept like stopping to kind of check in with myself and not like overwhelm myself. But I would say that chapter 1 probably has like the most extensive amount of like, I guess, court cases and like scholarship, like deep academic scholarship.
Any other questions directly for Jacob at this point? Well, all right then, with that, I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor once again to all of our participants. If you have questions for any of them, we have about 20 minutes. If you want to start with Jacob or Alejandra or Annalise, that's fine. You don't have to tie the question together into one theme, but if you have a question for any of them or all of them, this is the time, please. They will entertain your questions. Once again, through the chat would be most helpful. There's a question in the Q&A from Dr. Chavez to all three of you. I don't know who wants to start first, but if you can read the Q&A, there is that one question you all can share. If either one of you wants to start, and then all three of you give it a shot.
So I can give it a shot first. So for me, it's been trying to figure out how to represent an area that I come from and an area that I'm very familiar with on this larger like historical context for my my discipline in history, because I was met at the beginning with a lot of so what and why does this matter, and I think for me it was because most of the history that is focused on is the violence on the border, which I know is very important that that work is done. But I think that there is also this other side of the like celebration and the culture that these large industries that were mainly like the lifeblood of them were these Mexican and Mexican American laborers that, like I said, didn't get to like enjoy the like fruits of their labor in a sense, but at the same time not forgetting that the difficulties that they went through throughout the 20th century, that even though now they're looked at as these representations and these like legends, for the community to not just focus on the good, but remember that each of them had their path to now being this like representation. So on some levels, it's been fun to look at festivals and pageants, but then having to dig deeper and feel uncomfortable in those moments, especially when like I was gathering oral histories and the men were saying, well, it was okay that I didn't own anything. I just did my work and that was fine. And like pulling out the like reading in between those lines and putting it in the historical context of like these like power dynamics that existed.
I can go next. I think for me, like I talked about in the beginning, of just my inspiration for the work was just like all of the narratives and like the retelling of history that my grandfather would like constantly talk about. And I feel like back when I was like in high school and like middle school, and he would talk about these like just different stories every single time that I would see him, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, like I get it, like it was horrible, so what, like we moved on, we don't talk about this. I didn't even know that this was a thing like in the town except for when you talk about it. And then coming to college and like learning, especially within Mexican American Studies department, like just the history and especially of like South Texas, it kind of like illuminated this spark of like, wait, so everything that my grandfather was talking about was true. And like, now I want to research this and now I want to learn about this and what was really happening and why did it happen? And then kind of like connecting the dots between the things that he talked about and like the types of harassment he received to like what we see today in the media and like in politics. And it's just like we're constantly aware of what's going on. And so I don't know, it's been nice to like connect the dots between the past and the present. And for me, it highlighted why like this type of research is so important, because it's not something that like I thought, oh, that happened in the past, you know, that's not going on anymore. No, it's something that's very real, and it's something that's still happening and impacting our community today. And so that's why I think it's important, between all three of us, like the work that we're doing, it's so important to talk about these things today.
Thank you, Dr. Chavez, for that question. I think recognizing all of us doing Texas work and focusing mostly on Mexican Americans is very important, but there also is huge Black and Indigenous populations that made Texas a very diverse place to be, even before the time periods that we focus on, and realizing that there's so many gaps in that history and kind of changes in racial categorizations that have left us now with like Texan populations that are hugely uninsured, that are sick, that are going into debt because they're sick, that were affected by COVID-19, that still have very precarious labor, employment as well. So that kind of impact is very direct. And I think that these like small contributions play into answering those questions, not just for making Mexican American communities, making Texas Latinx communities better understood, but for also grasping at why so many are swinging right now. What is it about the changes in identity and border and labor that causes these people to also have all of this infighting and prejudices toward each other? The fluctuating power dynamics, I think, that all of us brought up are really important to the present political moment, as like disheartening as it is for me to see numbers in how people are voting and how COVID-19 has affected Texas in particular. I think that it makes all of this work really important contributions to understanding that just a little better.
Other questions for our panelists, once again, in the chat or the Q&A as needed, but once again, written questions, please, for our panelists. We have about another 10 minutes of this time. I will take the host's prerogative and ask you all an oral question. What's next? Anneleise, what's next for you? Alejandra, then what's next for you? And Jacob, then what's next for you?
I'm hoping to defend my dissertation in June or July. So very soon I'm making edits and wrapping this up. Right now I have a fellowship at the University of Helsinki in their North American Studies department and their Environmental Humanities Hub. So I will stay on my contract here as a postdoc at least till the near future, but I'll be on the job market this fall and living in Finland. Really random, but there's a lot of cool North American studies and American studies work being done here.
Excellent.
I am also going to be finishing my PhD in the summer. And I just got a job at the Holdsworth Center, which is a local education nonprofit. Yeah, so I'm really trying to wrap up my writing. But yeah, it's an amazing organization that works with school districts across Texas. It was founded by Charles Butt of HEB. So never thought I would find myself in the nonprofit world, but I'm really excited to continue my work with the organization.
HEB is like the backbone of Texas.
There's a project there for somebody. Jacob, please go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. For me, I'm focused on graduation in May, and I'm really excited about that. I am continuing to write and expand on the chapter that I presented because I'm still working with Dr. Vasquez, and we're hoping to just continue to like develop and add some more research and more archival material to that chapter, and maybe look at publication, but that's something for like the distant future. Other than that, I'm also studying for the LSAT, so my time is pretty busy right now.
Do we have any other questions, comments, suggestions, input for either, any, all of our panelists from the audience today?
I'm not sure. I know somebody asked earlier about the book, and the title is Borderlands Curanderos, and it's by Jennifer Koshatka Seaman, and I spelled Seaman wrong. It's Seman, but just Googled that during the talk.
Well, I hate to cut our program short, but if we have no further questions for our panelists, I think I will. Let me echo the comments from our chair, Dr. Chavez. We are so very grateful to each of you and all of you for these presentations today. Our two portfolio students, congratulations on wrapping up this spring and summer, and we wish you both the best professionally. Jacob, we wait to hear good things from you in the future as well. All of you, pat on the back, go enjoy your afternoons and go get some work done, obviously, to wrap it up this spring and summer. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. The second of the La Llegada Student Research Symposium will take place tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Visit the mall's website for registration and the link and all the information you need about our presenters. Once again, we thank you for joining us this afternoon. And once again, a round of applause virtually for our three presenters, Jacob, Alejandra, and Anneleise. They did a wonderful job this afternoon. Thank you all. And with that, we close our programming. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Luis.
Thank you all. You're more than welcome.